This is Judith Stove calling in from Sydney, Australia, and you're listening to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast.
Welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast, a podcast dedicated to exploring the applied philosophy of traditional Stoicism. The College of Stoic Philosophers is an online school founded in 2008. We at the college endeavor to educate all who would be Stoics and Stoic philosophers who aspire to the good life within the world community. Podcast episodes will include discussions of Stoic history, application, interviews, and much more, all while having some fun, fate permitting. I'm your host, Mark Sterry. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Judith Stove, welcome back to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. How's it going today there, Judith?
It's going great, and thanks for having me back on, Mark. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, of course. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. It was a joy to write. I had such a good time, and I've been really pleased with what people have said about it.
Awesome. What's new in Australia?
Well, we're in the middle of a very warm spring. We've got the cosmos is just bursting out into wonderful life everywhere, and it's just inspiring. I'm having a great time with it. What's
some of your hobbies you do besides Stoicism in Australia? Do you like gardening or anything like that in the spring?
Yeah, so I just like to be outdoors, observing wildlife. That's pretty much what I've been doing, as well as working on a few little kind of smaller Stoic projects, a bit of writing, maybe the odd article here and there. I've just finished the very successful Stoic on X Melbourne, which I was organising. We had over 60 people in the room for that, and we had stellar speakers. And then I did a talk at the Brisbane Stoics where Courtney Shipley is, and they invited me to talk as well. So I've had a few of those projects going on. So yeah, it's been quite a busy time.
When people ask you to talk, do you mostly talk about your book or other subjects regarding Stoicism, or what do you usually talk about?
Well, for the Brisbane Stoics, I did talk a little bit about my book and some of the themes that arose out of it, but I also worked it in with some other themes I'm thinking around at the moment to do with Stoicism as a practical approach to life, and what we might think when people who are in the broader Stoic community might not be behaving quite as we might expect, and I've had this kind of project going on for a bit called Stoics Behaving Badly, and trying to explore what the factors are and how we can kind of work that into our Stoic worldview.
Can you give us an example of Stoics behaving badly?
Sure. Well, the one that really got me thinking about it was when I was listening to the Stoic Conversations podcast, and they mentioned about the great Stoic advisor to the Emperor Augustus, Aurelius Didymus. Now, Aurelius Didymus is one of our main sources on Stoic ethics, but Aurelius Didymus is also the person who advised Octavian, who later became Augustus, to put to death the teenage son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar after Octavian had defeated Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BCE. And I was thinking, it sounds a bit unjust coming from a Stoic advisor, right, to advise the leader to put to death a young, unarmed, but possibly potential political rival. So that's what got me thinking about it, and how Stoics in the past, in antiquity, but also maybe today, have had to negotiate the real world considerations involved in their jobs and other roles.
Gotcha. Was that kid's name Caesarion?
Yes, that's right.
Judith just put out a book called Marcus Aurelius and His Legacy, Seeking Rome's Kingdom of Gold. So, Judith, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, thanks, Mike. Yes, there were two things, really. So the first thing that kind of triggered me to look deeper was realising, and I found this out quite by accident, that the great English novelist Daniel Defoe, who wrote the first English novel, the Robinson Crusoe, which came out in 1719, in that very same year, Daniel Defoe put out a work anonymously. He did put out a lot of anonymous material as well, called The Dumb Philosopher. And now this work called The Dumb Philosopher has been read as a kind of statement of Calvinist morality. But when I read an extract from it, I thought, hang on, that's not Calvinism. That's literally Marcus Aurelius' own words from the Meditations. And I looked a bit further, and so it proved to be. And so then I realised, hang on, this has been misattributed for 300 years. where else is Marcus hiding that in plain sight that we haven't noticed him? And so the other trigger, if you like, for doing the research for the book was realizing that, and this again, I realized this quite by accident, it came from looking at a travel guide from the 19th century. Marcus Aurelius's triumphal arch, which was put up after his victory over the northern tribes in the 170s, and it extended over what's now the Corso in Rome, but in those times was the Via Flaminia, the road out north towards the northern frontier, where Marcus and his legions would have gone. That triumphal arch seems to have remained in place until the middle of the 17th century, even though it had fallen into disrepair and it was got rid of at that time. Because it was an obstacle to traffic. And fortunately, though, before actually demolishing the arch altogether, the authorities took off it some of these relief panels which depict Marcus Aurelius in part of his battle duties, also sacrificing as a priest and extending the hand of peace to the conquered barbarians. So those amazing relief panels, one of which I've used for the cover of my book, can be seen, thank goodness, at the Capitoline Museums in Rome. And so it was those two kind of losses, I suppose, in a sense, or mysterious happenings around Marcus's legacies. On one hand, the literary legacy that was appropriated by someone else, a famous writer, and on the other hand, this material legacy of his wonderful monuments, which had kind of been survived in some respects and been destroyed in others. Those were the two ideas that led me to look deeper into Marcus's legacies.
When did you begin working on the book, and what was your writing process like?
I started writing it in 2023, and I'd finished it by mid-2024. So for me, that's quite a fast race. So that's finishing it in about a year. My previous two books, which were on the life and works of Jane Austen, each of them had taken considerably longer than that. So I think maybe I'm getting more efficient at this kind of thing. I do use as a productivity hack, if you like, I use the Pomodoro method. So it's a timer. You just download these timers, and the idea is that you work. I usually set a 25-minute timer, and in that period, I just work on what I'm working on, whether that's my writing or doing some research. And then when the timer bell goes, I can have a 5-minute break and then start again. And it's a very simple hack. It seems like it's so simple it wouldn't work, but for me, I find it actually very helpful for my productivity in working on research and writing. So yeah, I think I would have used that as my main method. My husband and I also took a trip to Rome and Vienna in early 2024, where we took some photos for the book and did some on-the-ground looking at some of these wonderful material remains and material legacies in Rome. So that's another important part of the book. But yeah, so that was kind of the method, and I'd already got in my mind more or less the topics I wanted to cover. So the material remains, the monuments, the literary impact. And so I was able to separate it out into chapters. And I also wanted to address Marcus in Hollywood because, of course, that is one way in which Marcus has really had such a massive impact on culture today, starting with Gladiator in 2000 and more recently with Gladiator 2.
Did you always plan to have a photo gallery in your book?
Yeah, I again, because my focus has been on these material, archaeological, architectural, and visual legacies of Marcus. And one that really came kind of relatively late, I was glad to be able to include, was the Rydale Hoard. Now, the Rydale Hoard is a set of small bronze objects, including this amazing little portrait of Marcus, which only came to light in 2020 from a metal detector in Britain. And what this little hoard means and the possibly religious uses of it, they're still being examined. So I would say that Marcus's material legacies are still emerging and we're still learning more about them. And yeah, that's another thing I was really keen to do in this book.
Can you share with the readers the genesis of the Walking with Marcus portions at the end of each chapter?
Sure. So in the book, I've included a section at the end of a number of chapters where people can have a look, and it gives hints about if you're interested in these locations, which in most cases Marcus would have known, so both in Rome and elsewhere, you might want to go and visit them yourself, because there's really nothing like it. I'm a late bloomer as far as the travel bug goes, but my husband and I, once we got it, we really got it. And so I love going to places where people I'm interested in have been, and Rome is so rich in all those settings. So one thing that we visited, and this was actually well before I started the book, we visited the Villa of Hadrian, which is at Tivoli outside Rome. And if you know anything about Hadrian, who was the emperor who decided when he saw Marcus as a young boy that Marcus had some supreme talents. He was a very serious boy, very good at everything he put his hand to, and Marcus saw something in that young boy, and he insisted that the person Hadrian adopted as his heir, that's Antoninus Pius, that Antoninus adopt the young Marcus and also Lucius Verus. And so one place where Marcus would have spent a lot of time in his youth and adolescence was Hadrian's villa outside Rome at Tivoli. And so that was the first place where we thought about walking with Marcus. And particularly because the Villa Adriana, as it's called, is such an amazing site. I mean, even if you have no interest in Marcus, it is so much worth a visit. Hadrian was a genius. He was a very complex character, and towards the end of his life, he was quite unwell, confused, and tyrannical. And unfortunately, that's the impression that I think a lot in the Stoic community have about him. But the other thing to realise about Hadrian is that he was an incredibly talented man, and particularly to do with architecture. So if people are in Rome, they'll always go and see the Pantheon, which is this amazing building, which thank goodness survives today. Now, the Pantheon predated Hadrian, but Hadrian was intimately involved in remodelling it and restoring it. And the other main Hadrianic site is this Villa Adriana at Tivoli. So, as I say, that's the first thing where you might want to go to walk with Marcus, because he would have walked there a lot when he was a young man. And particularly the thing that struck me so much is Hadrian was a great lover of all things Greek. And at the Villa Adriana, he set up this thing called the Peculae. Now, that's a strange word in modern Italian, and I didn't know what that meant, but it was like this walkway. Anyway, it's actually his version of the Stoa Poikile from Athens. It's a philosophical walkway. And so Hadrian actually put this there, and you can imagine a young Marcus, with his philosophical cloak on and his bare feet, just striding up and down here, imagining he was in the Stoa Poikile in Athens, which in fact he didn't actually visit till many, many decades later. But you can imagine that this beautiful, beautiful property with Hadrian's architectural amazing work everywhere must have had a massive impact on Marcus as on an aesthetic level. Even as I say, though, despite the fact that Hadrian himself became more and more difficult as he got older. So that was the start of walking with Marcus. And then there's another one which we thought would be great to put in. And when I say we, it's my husband and I. He's my companion and when we walk with Marcus, and he's taken the photos for the book, was to visit the Via Appia, the Appian Way south of Rome. So this is somewhere, again, where Marcus was intimately involved. He had properties there. His family had properties there. His friend, Herodes Atticus, who was Marcus's Greek tutor, Herodes had massive properties there. Some friends of Marcus's called the Quintilii, who were important governors and statesmen in Marcus's time, they had a massive property on the Via Appia, which you can see because part of it's been excavated. So this was another site which we thought was so important for people trying to understand how it was to be in Rome of Marcus's time. And so, yeah, that's the idea. If you want to go there, these places are accessible. They've done a lot in Rome in recent years to make some of these places easy to visit. You can ride a bike, hire a bike, you can walk. And I'd say that later in the book we go to Vienna, and this was because Marcus, with his legions, had to fight on the Danube frontier. He went north. Again, in Vienna, they've done some really good work in making the Roman site visible. So there's a section near, I think it's called Mark Aurel Strasse, the street's even named after him, where they've got like an excavation that goes down vertically, and you can see right into the officers' houses as they would have been of the military encampment there. And like many, of course, a Roman town, Vienna's contours were set by the Roman structure of squares, square streets. And so you can see those Roman bones even in Vienna. And the sort of the culminating walking with Marcus, I think, was about 40 minutes by train east of Vienna. It's on the Volstar line, I think. You go out to Petronell Carnuntum, which is where there was a very important Roman legionary encampment, and it's the place where possibly Marcus died in 180. We're not really sure where Marcus died, and that was another thing that I go into in the book. But he may have died in Vienna proper, or possibly at this point in the east at Carnuntum. Now, Carnuntum's this fantastic UNESCO site where they've done a lot of restoration of the Roman town as it would have been. And so you're walking around this town and it feels like, you know, the legionaries have just walked out for a bit, or the innkeepers must have just gone out for the day, or their families, you'll meet their families around the corner. It feels so authentic. It feels so personal. And one amazing thing that happened when we were there, one of the most iconic episodes from Marcus's military experience was what's called the rain miracle. So this is something that occurred during the Northern Wars, when a Roman legion was in a very bad position. They were surrounded. It was in summer, and it does get extremely hot in Eastern Europe in summer. And then suddenly there was this rainstorm, which gave water to the Romans and their horses, and as an added bonus, dropped hailstones on the enemy. And so this was a great triumph. And what's fascinating about the rain miracle is that the Christians who were in Marcus's army, they took the credit because they'd prayed to their God. Marcus's Egyptian magician, as he seemed to have one on staff, he'd worked with the Egyptian deities, and of course Marcus would have prayed to the Roman deities. Everyone took the credit for this amazing outcome. So thinking about the rain miracle, what happened when we were there was that this hailstorm came out of nowhere. It just suddenly started bucketing down, and we raced into the cafeteria where we had this amazing meal that, you know, was this beautiful stew that would have been exactly the same as they had in Roman times. But it kind of confirmed that in these parts, these sudden storms do really happen, and it kind of confirmed the substance of the rain miracle. So these are the things that happen when you're walking with Marcus. You kind of get these insights, really, into the built environment, into the natural environment, which you don't necessarily get without really entering into the world of Marcus. Sorry, that was a very long answer, Mark.
I love it. I love it. Diving back into something you mentioned earlier, what do you think the impact of Ridley Scott's movie Gladiator had on rekindling interest in Marcus and Stoicism as a whole?
I think it was absolutely key. I think the timing was was key. So just in the couple of years before, there'd been Tom Wolfe's book, A Man in Full. A few years earlier than that, there'd been Sharon Labelle's The Art of Living, which is, of course, an adaptation of Epictetus. Tom Wolfe brings in Epictetus into his novel. And then in 2000, the movie comes out. And I think it had a huge impact. For the first time in 2,000 years, I would say, after that, Marcus Aurelius became a household name. People knew who you meant when you talked about Marcus Aurelius. Unfortunately, the downside, and this is something I hope to have brought out in the book, I didn't feel the portrayal of Marcus was very satisfactory in that film. And I'm not sure if that's because I know more about him now than I would have then when the movie came out. But also looking back at The Fall of the Roman Empire from 1964, which the Ridley Scott production doesn't really credit at all, but of course it must have been an influence. Now, in that work, Alec Guinness was this amazing Marcus, and he really seemed to inhabit the role. The screenplay actually included material from the Meditations, which, as far as I know, doesn't happen at all in Gladiator. So, yeah, it was, as I say, perhaps an unsatisfactory depiction of Marcus, but that said, it brought him very much back, and Commodus, of course, very much back into public public notice. And I think it was a key moment in what we now know as the revival of Stoicism. Is that your impression too, do you think?
I agree. I think for me personally, yeah, I think it rekindled, like, who's this Marcus Aurelius guy? I've heard the name before, and I didn't discover Stoicism till way, way, way later. But this book definitely made me think that it may have popularized or sparked people's interest in Marcus and Stoicism.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. Even though the subject matter is really about Commodus and what happens after that, and Lucilla, I suppose, to some extent. I suppose one of the good things about the Hollywood tradition is it has brought Lucilla back into the public eye as well, and she's someone who really, had I think benefited from the depictions in the films.
So then jumping back to, you're talking about Hadrian. In the book you say Hadrian nicknamed Marcus him Verissimus, punning on his family name of Verus, true, sincere, honest, the superlative form of the adjective being used, so that Marcus was Mr. Honesty. When I was in my early Stoic studies, I was asked, are Stoics born or are they made? Do you think Marcus was a born Stoic?
I think he was a born philosopher, that's for sure. I think he was someone who thought deeply about things even before his kind of formal training. And I think we can see that. So one of the great resources we've got, thank goodness, and this is another kind of resource that's emerged over time, and again, quite by accident, is the corpus of letters between Marcus and his Latin tutor, Fronto. And I focus on that in one of the chapters of the book, because what that wonderful set of letters does is show us a young Marcus, and also showing him showing off a lot of the time. He's showing off his command of different literary styles, and that's both in Latin and Greek, because that's what he was studying. And he's someone who, his intelligence is just sparking off the page the whole time. And Fronto says things like, you have the most amazing gifts. Yeah, I'd suspect that Marcus was a student like no other, and that he long ago learnt whatever Fronto could teach him and went beyond that. And there's this very famous letter where Marcus explains to Fronto that he's been reading Aristo, this earlier Stoic. There's a bit of debate about the identity of this Aristo but I think almost certainly it's Aristo who was an early Stoic. He's in some senses called a heterodox Stoic, but that needn't concern us here. What Marcus got out of Aristo is this sense that the role of a serious person, a philosopher, is to improve their life, to be a better person. And he felt that he wasn't living up to that. He felt that the studies he'd undergone so far with Fronto had not been leading in that direction. And he realised his own shortcomings, and it's that desire to transform the self, which is so fundamental, I think, to all the ancient philosophical traditions. But in this case, Aristo was a Stoic, and this is the tradition that Marcus made this formal shift towards, away from just literary studies. It's not to say that all he learned from Fronto was literary styles. Fronto also helped him with public speaking, which is obviously going to be a key part of his role. And it's something that he says he felt nervous about. He says he's got this upcoming talk for the Senate, and he uses some word about being a little bit anxious about it. So I think Fronto would have helped him with that kind of thing. But in terms of his life overall, I think it was at that moment that he committed himself to always improving himself from a Stoic point of view.
As a working musician, I've battled with tinnitus in my ears for years. So it popped out at me when I was reading your book that Marcus had a son that died from an ear operation, and there was no public mourning due to the games of the Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Very Marcus behavior for sure. I was just curious, where did you gather all these interesting details on his life?
Yeah, I read pretty widely, I guess. But yeah, that chapter about Marcus's children and the deaths of so many of them, that was kind of harrowing, I found. So there's a couple of important things to note here. This also feeds into why Marcus appointed Commodus his successor. Before Marcus and Faustina, only one emperor, and that's Vespasian, had sons surviving to adulthood. So that's pretty extraordinary, right? It didn't happen to Julius Caesar, it didn't happen to Augustus, Tiberius, and all the rest. It didn't happen to any of them until Vespasian. And he had two sons, Titus and Domitian, each of whom succeeded him. Apart from that, it was the next most prolific, and in fact the most prolific overall emperor was Marcus. He and Faustina had, it's either 13 or 14 live births, of whom only a handful survived to adulthood, and that was Commodus and I think 4 girls. So yes, the reason why we have the information about one of the deaths of the children, and the one you refer to about from a tumour behind the ear, that's from the biographical tradition. Now, there's a few biographical sources. There's a Historia Augusta, which was written in Latin. There's a historian called Cassius Dio, who was a younger contemporary of Marcus and may have actually seen him on some public occasions, and he wrote in Greek. And there's Herodian, who was another Greek historian. So we have these sources, and each of them has something slightly different. Sometimes you can tell they're relying on each other, but each of them has slightly different details. And from memory, the detail about the little boy who died of the ear tumour was in the Historia Augusta, I think, or maybe it's one of the others. But as I say, they all have slightly different snippets. Now, what's interesting too about that is that Marcus had the best medical support in the ancient world in the form of Galen, his house physician, who was an incredible researcher and a theorist about medicine. And for researching this, I actually went into looking at Greek sources on tumours and cancers as far as I could. And I think I mentioned in the book that the treatment, Galen warns against doing surgeries on tumours because the loss of blood is likely to be so extreme. So, yeah, there were all these wrinkles around it, but basically, Galen was the gold standard, and yet he wasn't able to save this little boy. And I guess so many of these deaths we don't know about. That one we do, and that's why I speculate in that chapter that because Marcus and Faustina were first cousins, there may have been some genetic problems, singular or plural, which may have fed into the illnesses and deaths of so many of their children. And obviously they had no idea around that in antiquity. But in fact, Marcus, famously in book 1, just says kind of offhand that he's glad that none of his children have mental or physical disabilities. But maybe they did. Maybe there was a genetic component in all these family tragedies.
I found it really interesting reading about, in your book, the faulty human ends of Marcus's life, like the story you tell about Marcus playing a prank on local farmers. Were you surprised at all to read and learn about the human characteristics he had while writing this book, learning about this time in his life?
I wouldn't say I was surprised. I guess I was delighted.
That's my line too.
That prank where he writes to Fronto about he and his friends taking their horses deliberately just to cause trouble for the local shepherds. It's like, really? But again, that's exactly what young aristocrats often do, right? They just do stupid pranks. And he's kind of showing that he's not serious all the time. That's the subtext here is I can have fun too. But yeah, that kind of disappears once he kind of really knuckles down to his role. And of course he was apprenticed to Antoninus essentially for 20 years. He was supporting Antoninus in all his duties. And he says at one stage in his letters to Fronto, he says, look, I've just dictated 30 letters. I'm feeling a bit tired today. And that's while he was still a Caesar. That wasn't like the full workload. So yeah, his role was very exacting and there was less and less time for fun. But I do think, so for example, we do get little hints. And again, in some of the letters to Fronto, there's a famous letter. And the reason it's famous is that Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, wrote about it and said something I think is totally off base. He says something like, Marcus and his mother are talking about all these trivial things to do with, they're talking about a friend. Then Antoninus has gone off to the bath and they've been working on the harvest with the locals. And so my response to that is, well, no, this is not in any sense trivial. Marcus is expressing here the things that are really important to him, which are his family. He had a very close relationship with his mother, his family friends, it was Fronto and Fronto's wife and daughter. They were tuned into Antoninus' schedule, obviously, because he was the emperor, but also they were relaxing. They were on the country estate. They were listening with amusement to the locals talking about the harvest, and they seem to have integrated into the local goings on. It's a really human letter, and contra to Foucault, I think none of these things are trivial. I think they're all vitally important to to what was important to him, his family, his relationship with Antoninus, and his roles.
I was happy to see you included a reference to the Netflix series My Octopus Teacher, which confirms animals' practical intelligence. Can you talk a little bit about Marcus's interest in the marine world?
Sure. So I've got a chapter in the book called A Golden Book, and that's keeping the golden theme going. And this is, again, something I found totally by accident. I saw a reference somewhere to this work where it said, oh, yeah, and Marcus gave the author all this gold. I was like, hang on, I haven't heard about that anywhere else. So I had to go and have a look, right? And yes, there's this wonderful book, and there's a copy of it in the Loeb Classical Library. So that's with the Greek on the left and the English on the right. And the author is a man called Oppian, who came from Cilicia, which is in the very far east of the empire, now part of Turkey. And he wrote this work, which is an epic poem, and it's in Greek hexameters, and it's all about fish and the other animals in the ocean. And it's a beautiful work. And Oppian apparently came to Rome and gave a reading of it, and that would have been quite long, in front of Marcus and Commodus, because he's dedicating the work to them. Now, as I say, it's a beautiful work, and one of the things that Oppian does is to draw comparisons between the animal world and the human world. And this is a kind of traditional, I suppose, but it's got particular resonance, I think, from a Stoic perspective, because as Stoics insist, humans and animals, we're all coexistent in the cosmos. We're all organisms. We're all related. We're all in relationship. And so, yes, it's not surprising that we see, for instance, dolphins and their sophisticated social behaviours, or seals, or, as you point out, octopuses. And Oppian points to some sort of fun facts which turn out to have some basis as science has discovered. So the fact that sometimes octopuses climb trees. He says this, and scholars of centuries say, oh, that's rubbish. No, in fact, sometimes they do. Things like this. So on the one hand, it's an exploration of marine life. On another level, it's a kind of it draws parallels with human life. But thirdly, it's a work of natural science. And as we know, particularly from Seneca as well, again, the Stoics were fully invested in finding out about the natural world, partly because the more we know about the beautiful order of the world, the more intelligible things will become. You know, the project of understanding more about nature is entirely consonant with the Stoic project. And so that's partly, I think, where Marcus was coming from. And he must have loved the work, because he did give the author this extravagant reward. Accounts vary as to how much it was, but it was a reward in a lot of gold. So it was well worth Oppian's while doing this wonderful poem and going to recite it to Marcus.
Jumping back to something you talked about earlier, when I was a kid, my great-grandmother got me into watching The Bold and the Beautiful soap opera. So it did strike me as a bit scandalous to read that Marcus married his first cousin Faustina. Was that common in those times?
Yep. Well, this is something I had to research a bit as well, because I wasn't too sure either. So I would say it wasn't common, but it wasn't out of the question either. So there'd been a kind of a famous scandal, I guess, certainly controversy when the Emperor Claudius had wanted to marry, as his, I think, fourth wife, his niece Agrippina. And so that debate went before the Senate, and there was some toing and froing about that, whether that was acceptable. The Romans had this sort of rule of thumb that you couldn't marry someone closer than a first cousin. But first cousins seemed to be okay, even though for whatever reason they didn't seem to do it that often, as far as we can tell. So it wasn't unusual, but it wasn't out of the question either. Now, I think specifically in this case, there were some different things different factors at play. One was that Marcus had already been adopted as Antoninus' son formally. The other thing that was going on too was that Antoninus and his wife, Faustina I, Marcus's aunt, had 4 children, but only one of them survived to adulthood. One of the 4 children who didn't survive was a son. Now, if that son had survived, in all probability, Marcus would never have risen to be emperor anyway. But as it turned out, only one of the 4 survived, and that was a girl, Faustina II. So the Romans were very big on sort of cementing familial ties, and so it must have seemed like it would reinforce these family relationships for Marcus and the younger Faustina to be married. Although it did have, since Marcus was formally now Antoninus' son, it kind of did look a bit like as though he had been married to his sister. But I don't think the Romans would have seen that as problematic. I think they would have focused more on the kind of overall familial impact. And as I say, they had no idea about genetic problems arising from marriage with first cousins. I mean, marriage with first cousins is very much a practice alive today in many settings. And one of the resources I drew on for that chapter was some advice in Britain to communities where cousin marriage is still extremely common, letting them know that the risk of genetic problems is highly increased in first cousin marriage. So it's not as if the matter's gone away. It's still very much with us, I would say.
You share a quote in the book that has the line in it, "He was not particularly sorry to die, but rather to die while leaving such a son as an heir. For already Commodus had made it clear that he was dishonorable and cruel." Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Marcus and his now famous son, Commodus?
Sure. So very early on, this became the most negative aspect of Marcus's legacy in the way it was received, because it wasn't long before Commodus showed how incompetent he was to undertake the role that he had been left. There's actually evidence too that both Marcus and Faustina had an idea that Commodus was not up to the job. However, there were factors which I think forced Marcus's hand. The first is that of all the children, of all the sons that had died, well, Commodus hadn't died, which on some level must have meant that he was favoured by the gods. That was, I think, probably at work in the mind of Marcus and Faustina. There's also the evidence, and I think we need to take it at face value. I think it's in Cassius Dio. He says that Commodus wasn't born really bad, but he was rather, and Cassius Dio uses a Greek word which means like simple. He wasn't intellectually up to the task. So, and that historian, I think it was Cassius, said that basically as soon as Marcus died, bad people got hold of Commodus and made things a whole lot worse. I'd say we need to take that seriously. I'd say that, but also, so part of it is he was a surviving son. He was favoured by the gods, even though he may not have seemed very capable. He didn't exactly seem bad. And thirdly, and this is a factor which Donald Robertson, I know, has drawn out, if Marcus had decided, rather than Commodus, to appoint, say, a military officer as his heir, that might well have triggered a whole new civil war between different army factions. And that was something that nobody wanted. So there were these three factors in play. And I think between them, they were sufficient to excuse Marcus for the decision that proved to have been so terrible. Another thing we've got to bear in mind too, and I do mention this in the book, there's the great historian Edward Gibbon has got a very famous quote where he says, if you were to select a period of human history where people were at their happiest, it would have to be in the reign of the Antonines, and he means Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus. But for Gibbon, and it's quite a subtle analysis, he suggests that the ruin that came afterwards wasn't really down to Marcus choosing Commodus. Gibbon thought that the problem with the empire's decline was deeper seated than that, and it was going to happen anyway. So that's another thing to bear in mind, rather than sort of attributing the disaster that followed simply to Marcus's decision to appoint Commodus. Does that kind of answer the question? When we maybe got away with it a bit. I can talk a bit more about Commodus if you like, and what happened.
I think that gets it. I was just curious about their relationship.
Yeah. I think there's also hints in the historians that towards the end, Marcus knew that even though he'd got the best teachers and everything for Commodus, that things weren't going well. And yeah, there's also a hint, I think, again in Cassius Dio, that Faustina knew that Commodus wasn't really up to the job. So I think they kind of knew, but I think their hand was really forced.
Another line you have in the book is, during the anxious times in the mid-160s, as the Macromani, I'm not sure how to say that, were attacking the northern frontier, Marcus summoned priests from all over, performing foreign religious ceremonies, and purified the city in every way. Do you mind talking about what you learned on Marcus's view of the varieties of religions of the time?
Sure. This is really interesting, I think. So yes, Marcus was very pious. He honoured the gods. And in these very difficult times that he lived in and was the ruler in, so the plague, the Parthian Wars, and the Marcomannic Wars, it must have made sense to Marcus to get involved as many gods as possible and get them on side. And so there's evidence that he and his family were involved in what's called the cult of Cybele, which was technically a foreign cult. It had started in Syria. It had been actually in Rome for some time, but Marcus and his family seem to have got right into it, and there was a big festival in March involving priests who castrated themselves. That was kind of dramatic. Yeah, but it was now part of the calendar, and so Marcus and his family have got pictures of themselves on their coins, taking part in the not the bloodthirsty kind of stuff, but Lucilla and Faustina, I think, are depicted as kind of involved in they have the same kind of carriage as Cybele would have had. There's all these kind of visual cues that often we don't kind of get, but they're links to these cults. But yeah, it must have seemed sensible to have all the gods on side as far as possible. And I think that may have led to a kind of a reputation of Marcus as being even open to what would have been considered magic or superstition. So as I mentioned earlier, he seems to have had this Egyptian magician on staff. But again, that kind of made sense. When he was out on the frontier with the legions, there would have been soldiers in the army who would have been from Africa or had Egyptian connections, so it would have made sense for them to have someone who was tuned into their religion. And we also told, as I said, that there were Christian soldiers in Marcus's army. So that I might come back to that because that's an important point as regards whether Marcus was a persecutor of Christians or not. So yeah, in times of trouble, you might as well get as many gods on site as you can. And so that's why I think Marcus had this very open-minded approach. And also, if you look at the meditations, there's nothing exclusive, I would say, to the Roman pantheon in the meditations or really in Stoic theory at large. It's a cosmopolitan viewpoint. You might as be cosmopolitan in your view of the gods as well, right? You might as well rejoice in as many gods as you can. I think that was part of what was going on. Especially, as I say, when there's something at stake and you really need some help, which Marcus certainly did at different points in his reign.
Judith, we're going on 45, 50 minutes here, and we're just scratching the surface of all the interesting things you have in this book. It's a wealth of information for fans of Marcus Aurelius. Where do people get this book of yours?
Well, it's from Pen and Sword is the publisher, so they can order from Pen and Sword, but it's also through Amazon or other online booksellers. If they want to contact me, and that's judith.stove@gmail.com, I should be able to give them some directions as well. So, but yeah, it should be readily enough available. If not, contact me and I will point you in the right direction.
I contacted you because mine was lost in the mail, and I finally got it. So I have 2 copies of your book. So I think the proper thing to do is give it to this other friend of mine that's a budding Marcus Aurelius fan as a gift. So I think I'm going to give away the other copy that I have, if that's cool with you. I guess we'll leave with,
great.
What's your next Stoic writing adventure? What's your next potential book?
I don't have any books in the pipeline, Mark, but I'm always working on my Stoic practice. I'm undertaking the MAP Prosoche unit at the moment, so I'll be working on my journaling, and you never know, something may come out of that.
There you go. All right, Judith, thanks so much for being on the show. I sure appreciate it. It's great to see you and great to catch up again, and congratulations on this new book.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Please visit thecollegeofstoicphilosophers.org for information on the college, e-journal, and course offerings. Till next time, pro count time.